Grace, mercy, and peace to you, Internet, and welcome back to Lutheran in a Strange Land. This is now part 9, our penultimate entry in our series on cultivating chastity. And like last time, we're still considering the practical wisdom element of virtue. In other words, once you understand right from wrong, how then do you successfully fulfill your sexuality within marriage rather than fornicating? Now, last time we considered some of the ways in which we can resist temptation. This time, we're going to consider how we can actually pursue marriage. So let's just get into the list. Number 1, you do need to think about and plan for marriage. And yeah, you have to actually be deliberate about it. Don't just think of it as someday this is just going to happen to me when the stars align and when romance strikes and so forth. No, start thinking of plans to make marriage happen. And this is especially true for women. Men, we're already expected to take a fair amount of initiative, but a lot of Christian teachers will explicitly tell women in particular to just pray and wait for a man to appear, and that's just ridiculous. You can do that in societies whose customs guide people towards suitable marriages, but America in 2019 is absolutely not one of those societies. You have to plan. Now, you have to make sure your plans are flexible because, life never happens exactly the way you want it to. But you do need to be proactive. You need to have plans. You need to be ready to seize the moment when opportunities arise. And you need to make it a deliberate goal. For men, that means you need to try and become good husband and good father material. Women, you need to try to become good wife and good mother material. And everybody needs to actually look for suitable members of the opposite sex and try to establish relationships with them. Now, we'll get into some of the details on those in a bit, but you do need to learn to think in those terms. As you live your life, consider how what you are doing at any moment, what choices you're making, how are they either going to help or hinder your goal towards marriage? And parents, you have a big hand in this as well. You have a responsibility for your own kids here. Again, society is not going to teach your kids to value marriage enough to plan for it. You need to be the ones to do that. Even the church is not going to teach your kids to value marriage all that much. That's sad, but it's true. That one rests on you guys. You need to work to create an expectation of marriage as your kids grow older. Even if it's just, these gentle reminders that, someday when you get married and have kids of your own, you're going to be doing the same thing with them. Even just simple statements like that are extremely helpful towards creating that expectation. You need to learn to speak about marriage as a positive thing and not complain about your own in front of your kids. Work to make your own marriage a positive example, the kind of things that your kids would want to pursue. And if it helps, think of it as analogous to college. You probably have an expectation that your kids are going to go to college. And you've probably made that expectation very, very clear to them. And you're probably going to guide them towards a college that's a good fit for them personally. And you're probably going to make sure that they're prepared to be successful at a good college. Well, you know what? Marriage is way more important than college is. So you need to make sure that you do the same things on the subject of marriage as you're doing on the subject of college. You need to treat it as just as important. And you do need to take a role in helping to shape your kids' attitudes on the subject. Number 2, plan to marry sooner rather than later. And for sooner is relative from person to person. Sooner might mean something slightly different for one person than another. But for everybody, remaining celibate into your 30s is really, really hard. So why not make it easier on yourself? Marry younger. And quite frankly, if you're interested in having more than 2 kids, which we should be if we can, it's really, really impractical to wait until you're in your 30s before you start having kids. We don't like to talk about it, but when a woman hits her mid-30s, fertility starts declining very, very quickly. And there is a limited window for having a family, and you need to be ready to make the most of that. Now, I got married right after graduating college, and I can tell you that starting a life together right then, before you're establishing that career, that does have its challenges. It absolutely does. But as long as you are true to each other, as long as you are true to the vows you've made, those are exactly the kind of challenges that are going to make you better people in the long run. Likewise, marrying even younger while you're still in school, that is something to consider. There are certainly extra challenges and risks that are associated with marrying that young. But you have to balance those against the alternatives that are inherent in waiting, and we've talked about a lot of those already. Nothing says that married people can't study. And of course, some people will object. They'll say, but if you marry that young, what if somebody better comes along? Well, somebody better might always come along, no matter how long you wait until you get married. That's always possible. But it's not as though that you are somehow increasing your options if you put off marriage. Your options do not accumulate over time. Yeah, new people are going to come along, but old people are going to go away. And since you have absolutely no idea in advance when the best person is going to come into your life, that's just not a particularly useful or healthy way of looking at the whole situation. Don't fall into this trap we have of thinking that there is one and only one soulmate for you out there, and that you have to make sure that they are the one before you get married. You don't have to do that. That's not how these things work. Of course, more often than not, a lot of people are more concerned about missing out on that all-important college experience when you marry that young, if you settle down to marriage before you've graduated. But if that's all it is, Christians struggling with temptation need to seriously consider what is more important to them, what the world values or what Christ values. And again, parents, you need to start thinking in these terms as well. What are you going to do to make it possible for your kids to marry younger? Again, you've probably prepared to financially support your kids somewhat, at least in college. Well, again, marriage is more important. How have you prepared to help them with that? And seriously ask yourself, are you discouraging your kids from marrying sooner rather than later? Are you discouraging them from marrying young? Because that is the cultural expectation, that marriage is going to follow an established career. So make sure that you aren't reinforcing that expectation by being unduly skeptical of a desire that they have to marry young. Number 3, prepare for marriage financially. For men, that means you learn a trade, and lots of different ways to do that. Maybe that's a 4-year college, maybe that's a PhD, maybe it's vocational school or apprenticeships, or maybe it's starting a small business. There's no single right pathway to that, but you do need to be able to support a wife and children. Now, that's not the same thing as supporting them in the manner to which they've become accustomed, okay, or any arbitrary social standard for wealth. Your first residence is not going to look like your parents' house, and that's a good thing. Again, going through those kinds of experiences together, that's going to help make you better people and strengthen your marriage in the long run. It's good that you don't start out that way. But you do need to be able to provide for them in terms of food, clothing, shelter, and so forth. You have to have the capacity to cover the basics. Men and women, but especially women, be really, really careful of student loan debt. Finances are often a very difficult part of marriage, especially early on, especially if you are marrying younger. And starting out with $100,000 of collective debt between the two of you, that is a huge disadvantage, huge. And it will seriously delay your ability to do things like have a family or buy a house or any of those big milestones. I had a philosophy professor once who seriously told me that going into a lot of debt to get a philosophy PhD was an excellent financial decision. And all I can say about that is that it's a good thing he didn't teach economics. Education is really expensive these days. It's getting more expensive all the time. And the economic value of a college degree is dropping quite a bit. And it's really easy to get a bachelor's degree in something like art history by going tens of thousands of dollars into debt. But it is really, really hard to get out of tens of thousands of dollars worth of debt with nothing but an art history degree. And again, that's not to say it's not a subject that's worth studying, okay? It's just not worth studying unless you can afford to study it. If you are going into a debt for a college degree that isn't economically viable, then you cannot afford to study that. You have to choose something else, or even choose something other than college. At the very least, if you want to study subjects like that, you need to have a plan B. You need to have another major or some kind of trade that does have a good prospect for financial success. Also, seriously consider the idea that college is not a good financial investment for you. Don't marry the idea of getting a degree. It's not for everyone, no matter what TV tells you. And for men and women both, save money early. Just like starting out a marriage with debt makes things a lot harder, starting out a marriage with savings makes things a lot easier. And while you're still living at home and as a teenager and you're making money from your part-time jobs and it's all what our society would call disposable income, instead of disposing of it, save a lot of it. Just don't just spend it all on yourselves for the moment, but spend it or save it with a future family in mind. Learn to manage your money well. Number 4, learn to be broadly capable. And any real world skill is going to be helpful in marriage. Anything that can help you run a household better or take care of the millions of little tasks that it takes to run a household well. Men, you should probably focus on the traditionally masculine skills. Learn how to unclog a sink, learn how to change a tire, learn how to plant a garden, whatever. If you can talk to your dad about that, and if he's skilled in these things, ask him. Otherwise, the internet is your friend. There's a lot of really, really great information out there on all these kinds of things. I'm not a particularly handy guy, but I have nevertheless managed to do things like, do some significant repair work on my lawn tractor, or do some minor plumbing work around the house. I've even built a 12-foot bridge from scratch over a creek on our property when the old one got washed away. And I was able to do that by watching a few YouTube videos. And that's what it took. So what I'm saying is, don't be scared when you approach practical things like these. These things are not voodoo. Once you start learning how to do them, it's manageable. Some things you're always going to have to call experts for, but the more you can manage on your own, better off you're going to be in the long run. But don't stop with just the more masculine skills. Learn to cook too. Learn how to sew on a button. The more you're able to contribute to your household, the better. Ladies, same thing in reverse. You need to focus on the traditionally feminine skills, but nothing says you have to stop there. You need to know how to cook. You need to know how to, shop economically and maintain a household and basic childcare tasks and stuff like that. But if you can change a tire too, awesome. That's great. Anything that you can do is going to be helpful in the long run. And that kind of leads us to our next point. Number 5, embrace your gender. Don't listen to the folks who tell you that masculinity is toxic, and don't listen to the folks who tell you that femininity is weak. Okay, in general, men find femininity attractive, and women find masculinity attractive. So if you are aiming for marriage, you really need to keep that in mind. In other words, ladies, grow your hair long, put on a dress. Men, lift some weights, get a haircut, don't dress like a slob. And it's not just a matter of appearance, right? It's also about behavior. Men should make sure that they learn how to take initiative with things. Women need to make sure they learn how to be sweet and how to be kind and things like that. I'm not going to list, a million different examples of all this, but there are all these different aspects of gender that are enfleshed in our traditions and our appearances and our behaviors that we should be paying attention to. Now, that doesn't mean you don't have to follow like every one of those religiously, right? And so that you can be that perfect ideal woman or that perfect ideal man. Nobody's that person. Okay, those people don't exist. But what you can do is make sure that you do embrace the aspects of gender that dovetail well with your personality and with who you are personally, as well as the aspects of gender that really anybody can do regardless of who they are, regardless of personality or body type or things of that nature. You know what? Anybody can, take heavy things and move them back and forth. Okay, it's not a betrayal of who you are as a person to embrace gender roles in that way. And if you do those kinds of things, then you are going to end up having this one pretty well covered. It's going to benefit you in the long run. And number 6, you need to actually look for a spouse. Meaning you need to keep an eye out for people who would make a good husband or people who would make a good wife. And you need to try to initiate relationships with those people. You can't just wait for God to bring someone into your life, any more than you can wait for God to bring you dinner when you're hungry, okay? Yes, God is the one who ultimately provides all these things and the one to whom we should be grateful. But he does so through ordinary means, many of which involve our own efforts, and marriage is no exception to this. I mentioned this in the last episode, but leverage your friends and your family towards this task. Engage your social circle, and see if they know anybody who might be a good match for you. And that does mean that you're going to need to make it common knowledge that you are looking for marriage. So don't be ashamed of that. Again, the world tells you to be ashamed of this because you should be focusing on your career, and you should be focusing on your education, and you should be focusing on making money or making a difference or what have you. But don't give in to the lie. And also, don't shame the people who are trying to help you in that goal. There was an article I responded recently in The Federalist, and it was by a single woman who was, in some parts of the article, she was coming down on the people who, by trying to help her find a husband, were inadvertently implying that there was something wrong or unhappy or undesirable about her being single. Okay, don't do that. Don't be that person. Because let's face it, you don't get offended when people offer you something to eat when you're not hungry. Okay? There is a certain defensiveness going on in situations like that. You're not hungry simply because somebody had the audacity to offer you food, okay? You were already hungry, and you got reminded of that hunger, and maybe that reminder was unpleasant, but you know what? They're trying to help you. Okay, they're not the ones making you hungry in the first place. Which should be no surprise. God said it's not good for man to be alone, okay? And he made woman as to be a helpmeet for man. Men and women are literally made for each other, and those without the gift of celibacy, they're going to naturally desire that. So you may have been raised to think that career and education are the only things that you should take pride in. Women in particular are taught that these days. But you don't actually have to feel that way all the time, or even most of the time. It's okay to realize that that's not enough. So own that desire, admit to it, embrace it. Don't believe the feminists who tell you that there's something wrong with you if your career doesn't completely 100% satisfy you in every conceivable way. You don't have to pretend. And for the sake of your future marriage, you shouldn't pretend. You also need to be willing to initiate a relationship in addition to actually looking out for people. And this is for both men and women, although the challenges for each are a little bit different. For women, again, I think I mentioned this already, but there is this belief, especially among Christians, that women aren't allowed to ask guys out for some reason or another. But there's nothing biblical about that. There's nothing moral about that. That's a holdover from chivalry, not necessarily a good or positive holdover from chivalry. And even back in the days of courtship, which is where a lot of those Christian teachers will point you on this subject, women would still indicate their interest to men, okay? And they would do so before the men would start courting them. Because, think about it. It's not like gentlemen came calling at the house completely out of the blue, okay? Either the woman or her family had already expressed some kind of interest in some way before the guy came a-calling. So the whole focus on your education and career until a man shows up out of nowhere to win your heart, it's nonsense. Don't fall for that. And no, most guys are generally not going to think that you have loose morals if you ask guys out. We don't generally think that way. But they will know that you're interested in them, which very often that will actually make them more interested in you than they would be otherwise. But whether you explicitly ask for dates or not, you do need to be able to signal interest in a way that is clear to men, which is probably a different standard than you're used to. You'll need to find ways that satisfy both your own need for modesty as well as the practical clarity that you actually have to let people know that you're interested at the same time. Now for men, again, it's a little bit different. We are more expected to take the initiative. There's more social expectations for that. But there also seems to be this growing fear among a lot of young men of asking women out because of the possibility of rejection. Okay, and unfortunately, a lot of men seem to think that by holding back and avoiding rejection, they're not really being rejected. They're not really losing the game. They're just refusing to play the game in the first place. And, in part, this comes from an unpleasant reality in a fallen world, right? There's this feedback loop in society where women find social standing attractive in a man. But women will also be more likely to recognize social standing when other women have already recognized it by entering into a relationship with that person. Okay, it's the same kind of difficulty where, employers won't hire a person without experience, but a person can't gain experience without being hired by employers. It's the same kind of vicious circle going on. And yeah, it's not fair, but that's life. And it's ultimately solved exactly the same way, by putting yourself out there and pursuing relationships. You have to face your fear. You have to do the best you can regardless. And in the long run, again, that's a good thing. It's the kind of thing that's going to make you stronger. Because you can't avoid it. Married life is going to require courage from you. And we don't like to think about it, but it will specifically require you to, from time to time, stand up to your wife's disapproval. There's just no getting out of that. You can't let women's approval determine your value as a man. Okay? And there's nothing for it but to just bite the bullet, learn to do hard things, and there's no sense putting it off. Nobody likes rejection. Okay, it feels terrible. Nobody likes it, but it's not the end of the world. Even nuclear rejections aren't the end of the world. And when one woman says no, there are always plenty more girls on the girl tree that you can approach later on. But for men and women both, regardless of the unique challenges that we each face, don't just wait for a relationship to happen to you via circumstance. You need to be proactive. Doesn't mean you have to approach complete strangers all the time. You can develop platonic relationships first if you need to, but you need to do so in ways that don't sabotage the other person's ability to see you as an attractive member of the opposite sex. In other words, you need to do so in ways that don't put you in the friend zone. But we'll talk a little bit more about that next time, because that's where we're going to pause for now. So please like, comment, share, subscribe, and join us next time when we finally wrap up this series by considering how to avoid some of the ways in which Christians sabotage themselves when looking for a spouse.